Good afternoon, everyone. By my watch, it's 1:30, so I'm sure there will be some people slipping in a bit later, but we might as well get started. My name is Murray Fulton. I am a professor in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School at the Saskatoon campus, and I have the very distinct pleasure of moderating today's or this afternoon's session on trade issues around energy. We have a very diverse panel this afternoon, a set of individuals that are very well placed to comment on trade issues and to comment on them from various and quite different perspectives. What I'm going to do is introduce the three panelists just very briefly. There's more biographical information in the program. And then we'll just move through them in the way that they're listed on the program. And I've asked each of the presenters to keep the remarks to about 15 minutes, and that should give us lots of time for questions and discussion. So start jotting down things that you want to ask. I'll also ask them if they have questions for each other as well. Our first speaker will be Jeremy de Buer. Jeremy is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, and he is currently an adjunct. He's an adjunct professor, and he's currently in residence as a policy fellow at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy in Saskatoon. Jeremy specializes in technology and intellectual property issues. He has degrees from the University of Saskatchewan and Oxford University. He practiced law with the Department of Justice after clerking at the Federal Court of Appeal. Jeremy is a frequent consultant to law firms, creator groups, technology companies, think tanks, government departments, and international organizations. And I'm really looking forward to, I've heard Jeremy speak before, and he's always got something very interesting to say. I'm going to move now to Steve Dory, Senior Consultant with Charles River Associates, and the Chair of the Studies Committee, the Energy Council of Canada. I'll just give you some of Steve's recent activities. In 2009, 2010, Steve served as strategic advisor to the CEO of the Ontario Power Authority, providing advice to the executive of the authority on major developing trends and issues in North American power sector. In the 1990s, to go back a little bit and just to give you a bit of that history, Steve held a variety of senior positions in the Ontario Ministry of Finance, including Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for economic policy, and he was also for a time the Chief Economist of Ontario. Peter Phillips is a professor in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, also a Chief Economist at one point in his past. Peter has concentrated his activity in international political economy and undertakes research on governing transformative innovation, including regulation, policy, innovation systems, and intellectual property. So, with that as background, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Jeremy to the platform. Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Murray. Is there a remote control for the... Okay. Thank you very much for the generous introduction. I'm going to speak today about a topic that we haven't heard as much today as I thought we would. We haven't heard about it as much as I thought we would. That's the topic of biofuels. And I was trying to think over lunch and leading up to this presentation why that might be. And I think it's because we need a little bit of nuance in our understanding of energy mix and what it is when we talk about energy mix. And when we talk about bioenergy, and even more specifically biofuels, we're talking largely about transport fuels, which is an aspect of the energy mix we haven't really been talking about, or we haven't really been distinguishing so far this morning. We've been talking a lot about, at least from what I've heard, energy policy in general, and whenever we talk specifically, it seems to be about electricity or power in that sense. And this is really a presentation about trade in fuel and transport fuels. This work flows from work that I've been doing at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy while on sabbatical from the University of Ottawa. And it's funded by two related projects, one being ValGen. That's a project led by Peter Phillips and funded by Genome Canada through Genome Prairie. You can check out www.valgen.ca for more information. And the other one is the Canada-EU Trade, Environment and Technology Exchange. That's a research project funded by the European Commission, and it'll become clear why that's relevant to my talk when I mention negotiations between Canada and Europe for a comprehensive economic and trade agreement in which environmental and energy issues are very important. I'm going to talk about three questions today, and those questions are, first of all, what is happening and where? Second of all, why and how is this happening? And third of all, can we integrate policies? Now, notice that I've phrased that third question, can we integrate policies, as an operational question, not as a normative question. And I take for granted that we should integrate policies, and my question is, can we do it and how? So on that first question of what is happening and where, I think, first of all, it's important to give you a little bit of context about what biofuels are or what bioenergy is. And we're talking really about three sort of aspects of bioenergy. That is ethanol, biodiesel, and biomass. Now, ethanol is primarily made from corn or wheat. Biodiesel is made from canola or rapeseed oil or recycled cooking oils. And biomass, generally I'm referring here to wood pellets, dry wood pellets that are used. Ethanol and biodiesel are primarily transport fuels. Biomass is a little bit different. It can be used for alternative energy purposes. The first question that people put to me when I start talking about trade and biofuels is there any trade in biofuels? People tend to be surprised by the fact that biofuels is not a local issue. It is somewhat counterintuitive to think that it could be efficient to ship wood pellets from British Columbia to Europe, and somehow this would be environmentally more friendly or sustainable than using local fuel sources or local energy sources. But in fact, trade in biofuels is enormous. And I'll give you the ethanol statistics just to demonstrate. It's significant now, but it's going to grow by 300% by the end of the decade. Now, if you look at where Canada fits into this, the trade flows in ethanol, for example, are primarily from Brazil to the rest of the world. Canada, despite our agricultural industry and our what you would think might be an advantage, is actually a net importer of ethanol, and the same goes for biofuels. And if you look at the trend lines, those statistics are, we're going to be importing more and more biofuels over the next decade, more and more ethanol. If you are interested in knowing a little bit more about where in Canada biofuels are produced, you can see the map provided by the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association. The orange dots on the map are biodiesel plants, the green dots are ethanol plants, and you can see that production of both ethanol and biodiesel is spread geographically throughout the country. In Saskatchewan, we produce ethanol from wheat. In Ontario, ethanol is produced mostly from corn. Now, what's a little bit interesting about this is that as with flows of most energy, it's not an east-west flow. Most of the importing and exporting that happens, most of the trade flows are north-south in this respect. The one exception to the sort of general rule of northwest trade flows is in respect of the shipment of biofuels by sea, which there is a significant amount of. If you look especially at biomass, that's wood pellets, a lot of biomass is shipped through Vancouver, and in 2010 we shipped 1.6 million tons of that. And to give you a sense of the trend as opposed to the raw number, that's doubled in just 2 years. And these trends are supposed to continue. We're going to be producing more bioenergy, and as a result there'll be more and more trade. One of the reasons why this is happening is because of initiatives like this in Saskatchewan. Very recently, you see this press release from the Renewable Fuels Association talking about a boost to biodiesel with a 5-year, $26 million program just announced in the province's most recent budget. This press release ties closely into what I want to talk about in terms of the reasons why we are seeing such dramatic growth in the trade of bioenergy or biofuels. The reason this is happening is, make no mistake, because of heavy government intervention. It's not the fundamental economics of the biofuels industry. The economics of the biofuels industry is heavily skewed by government intervention in the form of subsidies and programs, as I just mentioned, but even more importantly, in the context of renewable fuel standards. Renewable fuel standards, or RFS, go by a variety of different names. I actually like to characterize them as renewable fuels mandates. You might hear them referred to as targets, but to a lawyer, these are important distinctions. A target is a goal or an aim. A mandate is a mandatory requirement, and that's what these are. They are embedded in legislation. And if you look at this legislation, you'll see that it's provincial legislation, it's federal legislation, and it's foreign enactments as well in Europe and European member states, in the United States, and states such as California. And so there's a whole quite complex thicket of regulatory instruments that do this. And just to give you a sense of what's happening in Canada, for example, this is just in respect of ethanol. There's a separate and distinct requirements for biodiesel. But this is renewable content in gasoline. In British Columbia, it's 5% by 2010, Alberta 5% by 2011. You can see Saskatchewan has one of the higher mandates in the country, and it's actually had such a mandate for much longer than most of the other provinces. Manitoba's the highest at 8.5% by 2008. Ontario's is 5%. So what's interesting about this is not the varying levels of the particular standard, the particular threshold of renewable content in gasoline, but the variability is significant. In the technical way in which these mandates are calculated and in which way they apply, none of these provincial mandates are calculated in the exact same way. All of the terms and the definitions and the dates of application are all different. So it's extraordinarily difficult to get a sense of what an integrated policy is like. We have just created in Canada federal renewable fuels, a federal renewable fuel standard, and that requires that 5% of content in gasoline be renewable effective 2010. If you're wondering how that compares to what's happening in other jurisdictions, you can see it's significantly less than in Europe, also significantly less than the United States, and of course the world leader, I suppose, in terms of having the highest mandate for proportion of renewable fuel in gasoline, or renewable content in gasoline, is Brazil, and they've had a 25% mandate since 2007. So the actual proportions are kind of all over the map, and they range from anywhere from 2.5% to as high as 25% globally. That's not necessarily problematic. That's sort of within the sovereign jurisdiction of each particular jurisdiction to decide what they want the particular mandate to be. But the problem is, when you have a global biofuels trade, you need to have systems that are at least comparable or compatible. The percentages are not a major challenge, but what is a major challenge is in respect of so-called sustainability criteria. So it's not simply in Europe that you need to have a certain percentage of renewable fuels or renewable content in transportation fuel by a certain date. It's that in order to qualify as renewable, in order to qualify toward that mandate, you have to meet certain sustainability criteria, okay? That means you need to demonstrate that there are minimum GHG reductions compared to conventional fuel sources over the life cycle of the production of the fuel, okay? So what you actually have to have is a formula that takes into account all of the greenhouse gas emissions from farm to fuel, if you're talking about, say, corn ethanol, for example. there are also particular land use restrictions so that you can't get credit for creating or growing ethanol by tearing down the rainforest or using highly biodiverse lands to grow renewable content. So these types of criteria are embedded in the regulation. Now, that poses some challenges, but the biggest of those challenges is that those criteria are widely variable across jurisdiction. There is very little consistency in the method that you calculate something like life cycle GHG emissions, and the land use restrictions applicable in each of these regulations are highly variable and quite different. So there are initiatives underway to try to integrate some of these concepts around sustainability. Currently, we see over 70 different initiatives worldwide, ranging from the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels to the Green Gold Label or the International Energy Agency Task Force 40, all trying to come up with some sort of an integrated approach to what it is we mean by sustainable biofuels. What I think a key lesson is for people who are interested in energy policy more broadly from this is that almost the only thing that everybody floating these criteria agrees upon is that the criteria should not be applied only to biofuels. That if you're going to apply sustainability criteria, they must be applied in a non-discriminatory fashion to all forms of energy. And so what I suspect we will see over the next 10 to 20 years is the emergence of sustainability criteria that were emerging, or that came from this debate about the sustainability of biofuels, but applied on a non-discriminatory basis to other forms of energy production. And so when you hear things like Europe trying to label the oil sands as dirty fuel, this is connected to the discussions that are taking place in the context of biofuels. So we can't segregate the issue of sustainability that's being discussed in the context of biofuels from the sustainability of other types of energy sources. And I think that what we'll see is a real confluence in the discourse around sustainability of all forms of energy production. Let me move now to discussion of integrating these policies and how it's possible. I suppose that you gather from the tone of my presentation so far that I believe that we should try to integrate these types of policies, not only across different sources of energy, but also across jurisdictions. So the question is, how can we do this? Well, the I don't know if it's the most logical place, but what an obvious starting point would be the World Trade Organization. And there are a number of different instruments that are relevant to integrating legal and regulatory and policies in respect of energy trade, ranging from tariffs to subsidies. I won't get into some of the quirks, like the fact that ethanol is characterized as an agricultural product as opposed to an energy product, whereas biodiesel is characterized alongside chemicals. It makes the whole system of even monitoring trade flows incredibly complicated. So the WTO is working on this, but the biggest area for the area of opportunity, I think, is in respect of technical barriers to trade, to try to get some of these sustainability criteria to at least, if not necessarily be harmonized, to align with each other. Canada and Europe are negotiating a comprehensive economic and trade agreement, and this represents another opportunity to make some progress in integrating policies in a sort of a transatlantic context anyways. In the event that it's difficult to get consensus among all members of the World Trade Organization, in contexts of like these bilateral negotiations, there's an opportunity to deal with some of these environmental issues. Whichever opportunity we look toward in terms of these opportunities, whichever one we seize, there are really 4 different ways in which you could start to facilitate regulatory cooperation and interaction. And if you look at all of these multi-jurisdictional initiatives, these are the 4 options that are on the table. One option is regulatory harmonization, where different jurisdictions actually adopt the same regulation or the same standard. That's very ambitious and it's very difficult to do, but it's sort of the the high watermark of regulatory cooperation. An alternative is mutual recognition, where you don't try and arrive at the exact same standard, but you recognize each other's standards as mutually compatible. This is somewhat less ambitious, but still has a similar effect. A third option is to create procedures and mechanisms that facilitate the spontaneous emergence of compatible standards, so that you don't actually agree on mutual recognition or particular standards, but you agree to create processes that will lead to the spontaneous creation of integrated standards. And of course, the fourth and the least ambitious would be simply information sharing. And I would submit that this event is an important step on the road toward at least starting to share information and starting a conversation about the integration of laws and regulations and policies. So thank you very much for your attention.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Very nice introduction to what happens when we start to trade these products internationally, and how they're going to have some sort of downstream effects on other sectors. Steve, come on up.
Okay, well, I'll
Are
speak
you
from here,
gonna
if that's
stay right
okay.
here?
Well, I'd like to thank the Johnson Shoyama School for the invitation for at least a couple of reasons. Today's budget day in Ontario, and while I won't escape the fallout, it's nice to not be there. One of the things Murray didn't mention about my background was I also spent 8 fabulous years in Regina with the Ministry of Finance and 5 years with the university here. One of the things that used to happen in those days, which was a while ago, was Alan Blakeney used to invite Tommy Shoyama back to give us pep talks on the joy of public service. So it's good to see him honored in all sorts of ways, and it's great to be back here. I thought I was going to talk about long-distance energy trade, but in the context of shipping wood pellets from Vancouver to Denmark, I guess Ontario and Labrador are pretty much next door. I left the Ontario Power Authority about a year ago, and I've been doing things that I love, really focused on clean, efficient energy systems, and that's got me involved with at least 3 organizations. Charles River Associates, just briefly, is a Boston-based global consulting firm. Couple of things they specialize in. One is modeling and building large grids, transmission power grids to integrate renewable power, gas grids to deliver gas, and I think that's really what I'm going to focus on today. They also advise city governments, New York City and others, about clean energy alternatives, and that's exciting stuff, which I won't talk about today. Second group I'm working with is NALCOR, which is Newfoundland and Labrador Power, and I'm representing them in Ontario. Once we figure out how to get through the intervening province, I will find a home for good, clean power from the Lower Churchill. And that's a wonderful project, and it's not going to be done tomorrow, but it's exciting. The third one is the Energy Council of Canada, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about the council. Over the past 2 years leading up to the World Energy Congress in Montreal in September, we had 11 forums across the country to deal with the 14 jurisdictions in Canada. One of those forums was actually in Regina last February. And what we did was look at the challenges and initiatives in every region of the country. And as a result of that, given the input, and the Regina Forum involved Premier Wall, it involved Kent Campbell and others, it was a really valuable exercise. What came out of that was a report called Building on Strength, Canada's Energy Policy Framework. And that was presented to the energy ministers in Montreal in September. The reason why that particular exercise I think is valuable is because it was really a bottom-up kind of exercise that recognized that every province, every region of the country has different history, different geography, different resource endowments, and any energy policy that doesn't recognize those differences in Canada is bound to fail. I've heard more about the NEP today than I have in the last 20 years in Ontario. But I did work in the Saskatchewan Ministry of Finance during that period, and we did have a standing rule that any communications with the federal government had to include the appropriate thank you for the latest census data. By the way, damn the NEP. So we well aware of the depth of feeling around the NEP, and I think that's what you get when you have top-down policies rather than bottom-up policies in this country. So that's why, to some extent, the Energy Council exercise was a bottom-up exercise. One of the things we found across the country was people have different approaches, but there were common themes. Everywhere across the country, using energy efficiently is a focus for the government, for every government and every jurisdiction. Developing cleaner energy sources, everybody's doing it, and it's important. Investing in making existing sources cleaner, absolutely. Everybody is doing that, and it's critical. Virtually everybody was talking about an integrated approach to energy planning, recognizing that different energy sources all have their place, but they have to work together to meet the needs of the particular region. And finally, and I guess my focus today, was a recognition across the country that we need to take advantage of trade. We need to take advantage of the strengths of our neighbors and to build on those opportunities. I'm going to talk about power trade because that's what I know. A lot of what I have to say, I think, applies to natural gas as well. This is all done in the context of global warming. And I think we know the magnitude of the challenge. Copenhagen and other places, the consensus seems to be that an increase of more than 2 degrees Celsius by 2050 is a recipe for disaster, that we have to manage to that, and that implies that greenhouse gas emissions in developed countries have to come down by something like 80%. And that's a fundamental change in the way we live and use energy. And so that's the context in which we're working. I think one of the exciting things is the growing consensus among the Canadian business community that we need to price carbon. That we can argue about the need to recycle whatever revenue we have from pricing carbon into investing in clean power, but that need seems to be broadly recognized by the business community, and that's a huge step forward. But it's not enough. We also need to work on standards. We also need to work on public investment in new clean energy technologies. But those things fit together. One of the things we found across the country again was the recognition of the role of trade in energy, and that reflects some pretty basic realities. The fact of the matter is energy resources tend to be located far from markets. The second thing is that different energy sources fit together, work together to meet needs, and nobody has them all. So trade has an important role to play. There's a certain attraction to the idea that we can have hugely decentralized energy production systems. We can all produce our own energy and have our own windmill and so on. I don't think that's particularly practical. One of the things we see is in both Canada and the US is renewable portfolio standards of various sorts. One of the recognitions that people are realizing is doing those things on a state-by-state basis or a province-by-province basis is probably not very practical. We know where the wind is. It's in Saskatchewan. It's in Texas. It's in Alberta. It's off the East Coast. It's off the West Coast. It's in the Great Lakes. That's where the wind is. We know where the sun shines. We know where the hydropower is, and it's really a question of let's take advantage of the resources where they are and find a way to deliver them to where they're needed, which brings you to large integrated power systems. One of the things that's exciting in that context is development of high voltage, extra high voltage transmission. Canada has traditionally been a world leader in long distance, large volume power transmission, primarily because of our hydro resources. But there's amazing things happening in India and China and Norway in terms of underwater opportunities. The technology is advancing very quickly, and the costs of moving large volumes using, for example, 800 kV DC technology, the losses are low and the costs are approaching 1/10 of the cost of smaller systems. So there are huge economies of building a big renewable energy integration. There's a lot of exciting things happening across the country. Just very briefly, the recently announced development of the Lower Churchill, or one of the Lower Churchill sites, and the delivery of power from the Lower Churchill to the island of Newfoundland, underwater to Cape Breton, and into New England is, in my view, partly because I work for Nalcor, but partly because I'm a Canadian that believes in taking advantage of the clean resources we have, is a hugely valuable initiative that involves at least 3 or 4 provinces and hopefully a number of states. Ontario and Quebec have just commissioned a back-to-back DC system that will allow real-time operation between the two systems, take advantage of the complementarity between wind and nuclear in Ontario and storable hydro in Quebec. Perfect fit, and it's a big step forward. British Columbia has announced that they're expanding their transmission system into the northwest corner of the province, initially to essentially to service some new mining opportunities, but ultimately that will have the ability to tie into the vast hydro resources in Alaska and the Yukon. And again, that's exciting stuff for me. New Brunswick is developing itself as an energy hub that can deliver natural gas, nuclear power, Canadian hydro, again, into the northeastern US market. Alberta's connection with Montana is, I think, a positive step forward in terms of integrating markets. The potential for the expansion of the Western Canada power grid that the minister talked about is a positive thing. Saskatchewan doing a small deal with Manitoba and potentially larger things in terms of importing hydropower from Manitoba. It's a little disheartening for somebody who also spent better part of a decade in Winnipeg. I think it all started when the Blue Bombers were transferred to the Eastern Conference. But somehow Manitoba has been exiled from Western Canada, and I think that's a shame. Because, well, they've got a lot of hydropower, and they also have a lot to bring to the party. But let me move on. One of the things that we heard in one of the forums, the forum we had in Montreal, Thierry Vandal, who's the CEO of Hydro-Quebec, used the phrase, which I love, the role of hydro is to push back coal. And that was really a vision. The coal is not in New England, it's not in Ontario. The coal is in that huge industrial belt south of the Great Lakes. That's a vision of a very large integrated system where you use different energy sources to complement each other. And I think it's a great vision. Anyway, there's a role for Newfoundland and Labrador there that Terry needs to think about, but let me move on very quickly because I'm running out of time to talk a little bit about challenges, because we confront our history, and sometimes our history stands in the way of doing things that are sensible. There's a history in Canada of provincial utilities thinking that their role is to meet all of the province's needs, and it's probably most evident in Ontario, but other provincial utilities have a similar mindset. I guess partly it's a fear that external supply will not be reliable. It's a fear that if we become dependent on our neighbors, somehow they will take advantage of us down the road. It's also what I think is a little bit, well, in the context of renewable energy, it's a focus on job creation. So in Ontario, we're not going to put the windmills where the wind is. We're going to put them where it isn't and pay a huge amount of money to subsidize clean energy. I mean, it doesn't, that's not the way Canada was built. We were built as a trading jurisdiction that we do what we do well, and we take advantage of it by selling it to our neighbors. So the recent moratorium on offshore wind in Ontario, I mean, that's where the wind blows in Ontario. It blows in the Great Lakes, and so, anyway, some of the Ontario madness. There's also, as you well know, a fair amount of historical baggage between different parts of the country. Quebec and Newfoundland, Labrador, I'm intimately involved in that exercise, and it's just bitter, and it's damaging. There's also some history between Ontario and Quebec, which is unfortunate. We're trying to move past that. I think, given all the talk about the National Energy Program, there's a little bit of history between Eastern and Western Canada that we need to get over. The other challenges, the lack of carbon pricing. I mean, we need to get there, and we need a substantial price that leads people to change what they do. The other thing, I guess, is technology keeps changing. Shale gas, I think shale gas is for real. I think it's going to be the dominant fuel in the U.S., but it's changed over the past 10 years. We've been from cheap gas to $14 gas to $4 gas. It's a moving target. Nuclear, things keep changing. So we need to be nimble. But we need to make the big commitments that are required. So just in conclusion, trade in clean energy, I think, is a big part of the future for Canada. Trade within Canada, but also trade north-south. There's a lot of opportunities, but there's also major challenges, and we need to get on with addressing those challenges. So thank you.
Steve, thank you very much for some additional ideas. It strikes me Jeremy was talking to us about what we need in terms of standards to move things. We also, of course, need, in the case of electricity and other things, we need these infrastructure things to move. And putting the standards in place is just as difficult as putting in the infrastructure, and vice versa. Peter, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I don't normally talk about energy issues, but today I've had to put some thought to where does energy fit into the world of research around trade and what it might mean for trade policy and energy policy more broadly. So let me start with a key point, and that is that the traditional focus of trade policy is about stopping producers from exploiting consumers. That's what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether it's local, national, or international. We assume the only rapacious actor in the system is a private company who wants to erect barriers, ramp up prices, and create a rent that they unfairly walk away from. And so there's a rent-seeking underpinning to most of our trade policy. And it doesn't matter whether it's in your local hometown related to procurement or globally at the WTO and other areas. The problem is that the 21st century issues about trade have nothing to do with producer protectionism. They have to do with consumer protectionism. consumers and or citizens. Sometimes it's embodied in the context of consumers, but sometimes it's people who aren't even part of the transaction who want to impose their norms and standards on the transaction. The difficulty is, every time you erect a barrier, you're going to create a possibility for a rent. And even though you may have the best of intentions to walk in and create a system that benefits society through socioeconomic considerations, you're going to create a rent that somebody's going to come along and exploit. If it isn't the consumer and the citizen, it's going to be somebody else coming along, the standard setters, one of my key colleagues sells carbon credits. He says it's a wonderful opportunity to extract a rent out of the market. So this is the fundamental problem, and I think the wedge between them that's both the problem and the opportunity is the standards. What we want and how we know what we want and how we create credible adjudication of those. So just a couple of quick points to sort of move it from bioenergy and what is largely a discussion about energy in North America and how we in Canada connect to that. I mean, I think one point that's worth pointing out is that there are massive rents in this system already. The contribution to the economy of the energy part of of Saskatchewan is only about 6% of our labor force, yet it generates about 16% of GDP. So there's a 10% rent that is either being captured by people within the industry, people who own the capital in the industry, or more likely by governments that use it as a major tax revenue. So there's built-in rents already because the world is structured in a way that we're pricing above marginal cost. We also have interests that span local through global. In Saskatchewan, we have about 20% plus or minus of our total exports that are energy related. And as you can see, about 3/4 of those go to international markets and 1/4 remain within the rest of Canada. And it varies depending on whether you're talking about crude oil, natural gas, uranium, or electricity. And then all of the other less quantifiable measures that are embedded in various parts of the trade statistics. The world is sort of parceled out in a variety of different ways. There's a lot of similarity, but in practice we have some domestic processes, we have some continental processes or close friends processes, and this is where the CETA agreement that Jeremy was talking about fits in. And then we have a variety of international processes that govern the rules and the mechanisms that we're using. And so in that, let me go through them very quickly. The Agreement on Internal Trade was actually precipitated in many ways by our international agreements. The final agreement and implementation of the NAFTA, the first CUSTA and then NAFTA, precipitated a debate domestically saying, why is it easier to trade, I mean, this was a myth more than a reality, but why is it easier to trade with North Dakota than it is with Manitoba? And hence we entered into a process. We used a lot of the international structures to drive the Agreement on Internal Trade. It's principles based. It has the concept of non-discrimination, which means anybody who's a party to the agreement, it should be treated equally. A right of entry and exit, which means you don't erect artificial barriers. A prohibition on measures that restrict movement within Canada of domestic labor and capital for the most part. Limited obstacles on operations of movement. A provision that for legitimate objectives we can derogate from our agreements. So it isn't market only, but it's market plus other standards, but you have to actually make a case and actually incorporate it into some transparent, structured way. And standards-based rules and transparency were part of that package. We do have an investment chapter there that does have some restrictions on performance measures and labor mobility, and then there's a labor mobility chapter that is, as much as possible, attempting to encourage people to move across and optimize their incomes and their returns on capital within the Canadian market. We have a dispute settlement system, but it's more of a best efforts name and shame than practically enforcing and adjudicating rules within Canada. As I said, that was precipitated to a great extent by the national effort to engage more extensively within the continental economy. First with the Canada-US trade agreement and then with the NAFTA that was finally implemented in 1994. It essentially constrains the ability of parties to use dual pricing in the context of energy use. So we don't really, for the most part, govern energy trade in a lot of these agreements. What we govern is the products that embody energy in terms of the actual trade rules. And so what we're worried about is people will restrict exports, use it to build up an industrial a chemical or other energy-intensive industry domestically, and then export those at below cost or below some constructed cost system. So the intent was to narrow restrictions or export restrictions to stop that ability to try and artificially develop or proactively through local and regional measures develop industries that would not otherwise be there. And the WTO had a fair number of restrictions. This just tightens them a little bit. And of course, it was the actual basis for the AIT chapter. I was for my sins, the Saskatchewan negotiator on the investment chapter on the AIT. And it's almost word for word in many cases, taken straight out of the CUSTA and then the NAFTA agreement. So national treatment, most favored nation, prohibition on performance requirements, and no expropriation without compensation. So it's embodying in a more tightly judiciable way, and it has a judiciable dispute settlement system, but it's very much designed to deal with it through our national processes rather than through some independent and third-party arbiter. The GATT or the WTO is where everybody really focuses because it actually has teeth. It's fairly all-encompassing now, and it actually can, if you derogate or adjudicate it as having broken the rules in one area, they can actually hit you in a broad range of other areas and withdraw benefits from the agreement. Once again, it's a principles-based system. Non-discrimination. We tend to treat like products. This is where we get into some really tricky debates. Is oil oil? Is sustainably developed oil different than non-sustainably developed and traded oil, even though biochemically or chemically it's identical? Certain people are making arguments it might be. So all of a sudden we're starting to see an opening in the non-discrimination clauses there. National treatments there, most favored nation. So the idea is that it's very much driven by broad rules, and then we attach our individual commitments within those broad rules. Ultimately, though, the goal is to discipline the domestic policies of members to meet the principles of non-discrimination. It's very much tightly designed. It doesn't have all the rules built into it. So when something new, like consumer and citizen demand comes in, the question is, how do you then flesh that out and make it practical? In terms of energy, it has a bit more of a checkered area. It's interesting that much of what Saskatchewan trades has had limited or special status within the international trading regime. Agriculture was largely exempt until the WTO agreement in 1995, and energy has been largely politically governed, partly because most of the producers were outside of the agreement. I mean, if you're not a member, you're not governed by the rules of the system. Now, many of those have joined, and that's increased the transparency and the adherence to the international standards of trade through marginal cost pricing as much as possible. The major policy problem that the GATT has been dealing with has been this dual pricing, low domestic prices, high export prices, and trying to govern that. Not very effectively. We do govern quantitative restraint, but we have a lot of room for derogation within the system. So for the most part, the energy stuff that we're really interested in isn't really tightly controlled, partly because of membership, partly because there are enough rules around that allow for deviations from the norms. We do, as I mentioned, we do have a dispute settlement system, and we've only really had 3 cases since the beginning of the GATT WTO world that have explicitly looked at energy trade, and they've been very much about national treatment and discrimination between 2 people producing, broadly speaking, the same issue. So the gas guzzler taxes in the 70s that treated different cars from different jurisdictions differently based on fleet size and fleet calculations. Sounds a bit like a mandate, trying to figure out what's the environmental impact of the policies. And so there was a case that the Americans were found to be not in derogation of their rules, but there's some gray areas around that. There was another GATT case related to superfund taxing, which was about environmental rules, and the Americans were found to have been discriminating because of the way they calculated the formulas and whose products were treated as non-environmentally invasive versus environmentally invasive. And then more recently under the WTO, there was a GATT case related to reformulating gasoline, and the Americans were found to have actually infringed the benefits of Venezuela and a number of other energy exporting countries. So very arcane, but essentially the problems we're facing in the 21st century of people wanting to differentiate based on provenance of product are embedded in 35 years of cases at the WTO. Now, the problem is that the WTO has a framework but no answers. It has a whole variety of places where standards are discussed. In Article 20, we can derogate from the most favored nation national treatment, non-discriminatory rules for health and environmental reasons, for conservation, for commodity agreements, and those can sometimes be embedded in SPS if there's a health and safety element to them, which environment could fit under, and sometimes under technical barriers to trade, which is the TBT agreement. The imposition of trade barriers generally requires some objective, some non-discrimination, so I can't treat Venezuela different than Brazil if they're doing the same thing, if they're both members. The least distorting option to be chosen, so you don't pick the most trade distorting option, you pick the least one of all the options available, and that generally there's a push towards harmonization, mutual recognition, and transparency. All good ideas. Science is embedded in it, but not enough, and we generally rely as much as possible on agreements that are made outside of this structure. So could be in the food and health area of Codex, it could be through the Plant Protection Convention, it could be ISO or whatever. And countries can go higher, but they have to be able to demonstrate that the higher standards of performance are legitimate and have some justification attached to them. And then we have the European Energy Charter. I won't amplify it, but it's an explicit agreement that brings in Russia, and we in Canada and the US are observers, so it's really trying to deal with investment. It's trying to govern and control through the soft rules in the pre-investment stage, and then through hard rules in terms of post-investment stage, so there isn't expropriation without compensation. And I won't belabor because the time is short, and I'm down to my 3-minute warning, which is about right. Kyoto is one of those mechanisms we're talking about using as a way of integrating new standards, new things that have nothing to do with the product as it's traded, which is the way that our trade system is designed. We don't care about how you produced it. We just care that it is what it is when it crosses an international boundary. So the context has changed. If our economic model and everything we designed was to deal with producer protection, and then along comes consumer and citizen demands, somehow we've got to deal with that. We can deal with it in the trade system or external to the trade system. And there's just about anything with energy has very derogatory and inflammatory words, visuals, and structures. Hell no, we won't glow, the tar sands with dripping flags, you name it, it's out there. One of the concerns that those of us who deal with trade policy have is that the traditional model is we go back and ask the scientists to give us more detail. Science isn't going to do it. There is no scientific consensus. Even if there is, there's always at least one person who can say, I disagree. The evidence tells me something different. So you'll never have enough science to convince everyone to change the public debate, to inform and educate and bring people along. So there's a whole variety of implications of that. And at the end of the day, what we end up with is political precaution. We get governments saying, well, if you can't give me a certain answer, I'm just going to take the easy out and say, let's pause the process. That's why trade negotiations take forever to go through these days, because we're not just talking about border measures anymore. We're talking about domestic production and marketing systems. So in a way, we're groping towards a new intellectual framework and an architecture. We have a risk analysis system. It's embedded in those colorful covers down there, the red book, the orange book, the blue book. We have a set of international trade rules, but they're challenged by this rise of consumer and citizen engagement. We have intellectual property systems that are actually engaged in part of this. So let me take you through sort of the W5 plus H of where a new architecture might come from. And there's some basic questions one has to ask. Why are you asking this? Are you looking for compromise? Are you looking to broaden or refine the issue? Are we looking for convergence or divergence within the system? And most of these processes haven't asked that basic question. They're historically driven, and then they're presented with a new set of problems. What are we trying to move towards? In many cases, we haven't got an agreement on language and terminology. I'm part of an international process right now where we're talking about economic and social considerations in policy. There's 126 people from around the world. We've identified over 10 different organizations, all who've used different phraseology for what they think should fit within, broadly speaking, trade and science-based regulatory regimes. So what can we normalize? Language, terminology, what's a mandate, how do we measure these things? How do we record them? How do we track them? Who should do this? So far, most of this discussion has been about governments doing for the rest of us. In many cases, the markets and the civil authorities are going to be vital actors to this. They're the ones that have the most at stake. It's their norms that are being reflected in this. This isn't state norms. This is personal and group norms. And the market is the one that's going to have to deliver it. When, do you do it when the market's up? Do you do it when the market's down? Because the market will not always be up. You know, we're running around $100 a barrel. We were at $150 a while ago, and we dropped down below 50 in a very short period of time. So we're going to have ups and downs. Where is going to be a big problem because there's no obvious site. Do you do it domestically through agreements like AIT or bilaterally, as we've heard about? Do we do it at a continental level where we've got a lot in common and a lot of similar interests and groups? Do we do it at an international level where we understand the actors like the WTO, or do we open it up to new venues like Kyoto and others where you've got a whole new set of actors engaged in the dialogue and discussion? And then ultimately there's this question of how. I mean, as trade policy people, we talk about boundary drawing. Simplest way is just assign property rights and be done with it. Let the market figure it out. Probably won't figure it out very efficiently, effectively, but that's a model that's out there. So boundary drawing is one way to do it, and then just stand back and let them figure it out. There's a whole bunch of intergovernmental processes we've tried over the last 30 years. You can go by principles, you can go by bid and ask, find two people who have most at stake, have them negotiated bilaterally, and then multilateralize that through the most favored nation clause. We can use formula, Swiss formula. In the agricultural world, we invented these systems. We can use consensus. Very hard when you're dealing with norms and principles and not dollars and cents, which have a nice simple numeraire. There has been a temptation and an effort to move and defer this to wise men. We kick it up to a group of, the panel of the IPPC or, IPCC. There's too many of these types of spaghetti soup or alphabet soups out there. So you can throw it up to wise men. We could, in fact, just say, let it rip. Everybody can claim whatever they want, and we'll let the trade law figure it out. And it will. I mean, it's dealt with 3 of them. 30 years from now, the lawyers will be rich. Economists who are on the panels will be reasonably comfortable, but we'll have had a lot of impeded trade or distorted trade in the period. And then finally, one model that's a tempting one to do is punt. If in doubt, and there's a phalanx of people coming at you, punt the ball. Punt it to a different forum. That's why we keep creating new forms for some of these things. And so there's a whole diversity of hows out there. But at the end of the day, we have to live. We have to make decisions. Energy is a critical part, and we are inextricably linked to not only the domestic trade regime for energy flows, but also to the international regime. The current trade system does us pretty well if all we're interested in and concerned about is dealing with producer interests. We're a producer. We're competing against other producers. For the most part, we won't do too badly if that's all that actually rises and gets onto the agenda. The difficulty, and the one I haven't got a complete answer for you today, is that the two new trade issues are related to new science, new standards, new norms, new principles, and those cannot be fully managed under the principle-based architecture we've created to govern risk and safety and trade over the past half century. So I suspect what we're looking for is a new trade architecture. It may come through CETA, it may come through these bilaterals, but it probably, if we have this conversation in a quarter century from now, when we're all nearing the end of our productive lives as practitioners, we'll have discovered there's a whole new institutional architecture that's been created to deal with what are fundamentally things that don't fit in the policy system we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm just going to stay here as we go into this next part. Thanks to the very good efforts of our panel members who stayed very nicely on time. Thank you. We have lots of time for questions. as you put your mind to what you would like to ask the panelists, let me kick things off with with going back to one of the things we heard this morning at the plenary session. Bob Page said that while technical innovation will be important, will continue to be important, perhaps even more important will be institutional innovation. And in a way, I think all three of our panelists were talking about the need to do that in various and sundry ways. So I'm going to lead off with a question for Jeremy first, because in a way, I think, Jeremy, if you see the world, the trade world needing to develop these criteria that will govern bioenergy, what you're really looking at is the development of new institutions for that trade arrangement. And I'm curious as to what you see would be the timeline for the development of these criteria. Are we looking at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What will the process look like? You spoke about you had 4 different ways of cooperating on regulation. The bottom one was information sharing. You said that's probably the right place to start. Do you move up that list, or is there another process? Can we learn anything from the one that comes to mind is the organic set of standards? Can we learn anything about how the world went about putting those together, or is this sufficiently different that we're going to have to look at something new? So let me start off with that.
Sure, I'll try to be relatively brief in my answer, because I actually think the answer is latent in what Peter said, in that we need new institutions to deal with this. But we don't need a new institution singular. There's not going to be a single mechanism where we can all get together and hash out these issues of sustainability criteria and all decide what those are going to be. These criteria already exist in legislation in the European Union and in various other jurisdictions. In Ontario, for example, in their renewable fuel standard, you get 2.5 times the credit for using ethanol that you've produced using cellulosic ethanol rather than using, say, corn or wheat. In Alberta, in its new renewable fuel standard, there are requirements for minimum GHG reductions in order to count toward its mandate. And so we see this in all of these jurisdictions already developing, and the question is, how are we going to move toward a convergence or an integration? And I think that we have to recognize that that will happen in an organic fashion. I don't mean in the way that this happened with organic certification standards. I mean it's going to happen organically over time. And what we have to realize, I think, is that this is not a top-down or formal institutional mechanism like the World Trade Organization or any of the other institutions that we've seen developing these standards in the past. Rather, we're dealing with a situation of a network governance or a multi-level governance where there are all kinds of different international institutions, national and provincial governments, non-governmental organizations, civil society, businesses self-regulating, and frankly, it's very, very messy. So what I think we need to do is, sure, start with information sharing, and an event like this is a great place to begin. But we need to move, I think, very quickly to creating systems of communication where we can see the emergence of these spontaneous standards starting to harmonize.
Let me add a couple of quick comments there. I think it's already begun. It just hasn't begun in a coherent, integrated way, and I'm not sure it can. I mean, we are seeing examples, I think, where different parts of the energy-related industry are just getting on and setting their own standards internally to deal with specific aspects, sometimes that are where the regulatory system's created a base, sometimes just because they think there's a market for it. There are some cases where the governments are getting together en masse and starting to pool what they have, because if you haven't got rules, it's very hard to negotiate. So you create your rules, then you put them on the table and see if you can move up that ladder from information through recognition into harmonization. And there are places where you're seeing bits of that around the industry. There are places where this needs to happen outside of industry and government. We still don't know what people think and will value from a societal perspective, except what the states have decided for us, around sustainability and environmental, how much are they willing to pay? What do they define and accept as part of that social package of sustainability? And to perhaps throw a bit of a wet blanket on this, in the broad international trade world, the whole idea of trying to normalize how we deal with science as it relates to sanitary and phytosanitary measures was raised but never got to the agenda before the Tokyo round. It was raised in the Tokyo round, which took 6 years to negotiate and another 4 or 5 years to implement. But it was still just an understanding. It wasn't a judiciable part of the agreement. So it was moving up from sort of up 1 or 2 stages from on Jeremy's scale. It was finally put into the agreement in the Uruguay round, which took 8 or 9 years to negotiate, and implementation is still underway today. So that's at least a 40-year process to go from we'll all do what we feel like and see if that has any trade implications to narrowing in on something that still isn't predictable and transparent for the bulk of the trade that involves sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So it doesn't mean you have to wait 40 years to see any impact, but it means it's going to be a long and tortuous path, and there isn't going to be one model that's going to work. Some exist already and are working, some will emerge.
I'll ask Steve if he has a comment. Anybody want to get in line?
Well, just to take this in a slightly different direction, one of the renewable portfolio standards that have been developed in most states have been a product of industry desires. Essentially, the wind lobby is what is behind renewable portfolio standards. So these are standards that are supposed to ensure that we have clean energy, but you exclude out-of-state production, you exclude big hydro, because those things could well swamp the people who thought they won the lottery, the wind guys, but that's not the way to make policy.
Or the corn guys.
Or the corn guys, yes.
Just one more point, Murray, to elaborate. You asked about time frame, and I think it's important that we conceive of integration as a process and not an event. So you can't say, well, in 5 years we will have integrated policy, or in 10 years we will have integrated policy. This is an event, or rather a process, that is already begun and
Yes.
will continue.
Yes. We'll go to a question.
Thanks very much. My name is Michael Mitchell. I'm with the economic arm of the Government of Saskatchewan, Enterprise Saskatchewan. My question is that when you look over the last 40 years, if I add a preamble to the question, if you look over the last 40 years, the understanding of gains from trade has changed remarkably. And in a globalized world, we have moved to a position where, I buy so much of my stuff that was made in China or India or wherever, and we accept that. And yet in energy, there seems to be a great reluctance to do that. And I'm wondering why that is. Is it because governments control so much of the energy markets as opposed to Walmart controlling so much of the distribution network for consumer goods, and they are much more willing to find the lowest cost? And so my question is to the panelists, why is it that the gains from trade in the energy field seem to have been so far behind the gains from trade in other consumer products? And therefore, you would think consumers would be pushing for that.
Well, I'll take a cut at it. I don't do work in this area, but I do know that there's a significant group of scholars who define the energy sector and energy in its totality as a foundational part of the global political economy. And their view is that whereas naval power and other sources of overt power in the past were critical, over the last generation, maybe 2 generations, there's been a redefining of what is power. You know, power not in the energy sense, but power in the political capacity to exert and determine outcomes, and energy has been part of that, and is partly played out. Interestingly enough, that group of scholars that have been defining energy as the foundation of the geopolitical system are, while energy is still out here raising headlines, they've moved on. They're talking about knowledge and innovation, and energy is just now, a lot of them are reconfiguring energy not as a product or something that has material substance. They say it's just packaged information. And if you look at the value added, the bulk of it is high knowledge workers and knowledge embodied and embedded in production systems. And so I think there's a disconnect in the geopolitical literature. They're onto the next generation of what they think is the root source of power. But I think in terms of politicians and in terms of the average citizen, gas in the pumps and the ability to turn on their electricity, and as we heard this morning, warm houses and cold beer is a determinant of their modern existence.
Yeah, at least in Eastern Canada and probably here as well, electricity for a variety of reasons is intensely political. And I guess in part that's because it's so critical, it has to be delivered in real time. You don't take chances, but it's, and so it's been publicly owned in most provinces. And somehow that's morphed into the rules of economics go out the window. One of the, I think the Green Energy Act in Ontario is probably the most striking recent example of that, where it's all about economic development. One of the great ironies is that when you look at producing solar panels and windmill blades, that's incredibly energy intensive activity. So if you ask yourself, where should we be producing those solar panels? The answer is probably in Quebec, where power's cheap, not in Ontario, where you're trying to gain some green energy benefits that may not make much sense. So again, one of the things I've been promoting, Quebec and Ontario are talking to each other about trade in various sorts, and there is an energy chapter. Let's produce if we're going to have solar panels, let's produce them where they're cheap, and let's Ontario gain from its strengths, which will be research and development and developing that technology. The tendency in North America to treat green energy as beyond the rules of economics, I think, is incredibly costly and will be a real barrier to making the progress we have to make.
And I would echo that in the context of bioenergy in particular. One of the primary policy objectives behind any initiative in the area of bioenergy is regional economic development, and especially rural economic development. And so that's an inherently protectionist policy, I think, so there's a reluctance. There's also a fundamental inseparability between energy security and this sort of sense that this is like an essential good. This is not just widgets, right? You can't outsource energy production without threatening security. Now that's of course false, but so there's a sense that that's the case. And then even more fundamentally, I think there's still a lack of a public acceptance of energy as a commodity that's tradable like widgets, though it's derived from commodities like oil and gas or corn or wind turbines. There's a reluctance to conceptualize energy as that kind of a commodity. I think it's related to the reason why we're experiencing some difficulty in doing things like pricing carbon. So that might be related to your question.
Great. Next, please.
Hi, my name is Sharon Lee Smith. I'm with Western Economic Diversification. It's a federal department. Thanks to the panel for your presentations. I'm interested in your thoughts on the post-Kyoto framework that on climate change internationally that you know developed and developing countries are working on through the UN system. And I thought it was really helpful, Peter, that you mentioned that as one of the inputs and one of the international drivers for energy and trade-related issues. And I'm just wondering if the panel has a view as to where you see it going, the post-Kyoto framework going, and the relationship back to the energy sector and what we would be doing with regulating it.
Maybe I can start. While I can probably develop a list of 8 or 10 different venues where we could have interesting and engaged processes of trying to find some commonality and move up that hierarchy from just disclosure to something that contributes to positive trade flows. My difficulty is that it's very hard to find a place where everybody can get a seat at the table. You take the WTO, Russia's not there. China's sort of there. There's still an accession, in a period of accession. There are other jurisdictions that are there in name but not with capacity. Most of the intergovernmental structures have somebody who's not there. I mean, the traditional place we would go as rich, industrialized democracies would be the OECD. But many of these issues transcend that elite group of countries. Kyoto sounds attractive. It has I think, some structural flaws, partly because the Americans have never been able to ratify the Convention on Biological Diversity. That's right. It's coming to its natural end, and there are ways of renewing, but the umbrella agreement just doesn't engage enough of the industrial society. Plus, I think there's something to keep in mind. A lot of the follow-on activity from the convention opened the process up to non-traditional actors, either directly or indirectly. In that we're not talking about responsible state-level representatives solely sitting at the table. NGOs, industry, either directly were sitting at some of those tables in the sub-agreements, or in some cases they were sitting there with token proxies. You know, the traditional concern of people who are worried about power politics in the modern era is that big nation states and big companies will create tributary states that will just be Me Too states. In fact, in this case, there's some evidence it's the other way around, that weak, disadvantaged states have become proxies of NGOs and other groups that have vested interests in the discussion, but not necessarily vested interests in finding a public good outcome, a vested interest in finding something that generates a rent for somebody, an unusual profit. And so I guess that's one of the concerns I have as someone who's concerned about not jumping wholeheartedly into what looks like a very popular process, because it has some flaws attached to it. Short timelines, which means you've got to re-up it. You know, none of them has perfect membership, and all of them are at least open to criticism as with unequal representation and power around the table. And given that this isn't about states doing what states do, this is about states trying to somehow mediate and moderate what non-state actors want done, that makes it really tricky, really fast.
Just briefly, it's immensely complex, and so when you have a system that's incredibly complex and you're trying to measure the absence of something you can't see, there are opportunities for mischief, and there are vested interests who are in the mischief business. So it is a real challenge. Just a commercial, again, the World Energy Council, which is did quite a good study last year. It was led by actually a lawyer from Toronto, but on rules of trade. That again, if you go to worldenergy.org, it's quite a good piece, and the WTO has come to the World Energy Council to ask for help on how you measure and define, the focus being how do you keep those mischief makers from distorting international trade for their own interest, using the public good as a reason or an excuse to get away with it.
Only, I guess, very briefly to say that I think the whole UNFCCC is one of the primary drivers behind the biofuels industry, and this is what's triggering sustainability criteria and a focus on life cycle GHG emissions, as opposed to just sort of this popular idea that we could switch toward biofuels, and it's that simple. So yeah, I see a relationship there, but I don't see that as being the forum where these issues will be resolved. I think it's part of the network of governance institutions.
Anyone else? At the risk of keeping you here, if you don't want to stay, I would I'd throw out one more question to the panel. And Steve, I'm going to start with you, though. I think Jeremy and Peter, you can both talk about this. It seems to me when you talked about one of the problems facing Canada right now is some of these. I'm going to call them mindsets, and the national energy policy would be one of these. How and my question is, how do we go about changing mindsets of people? I'm taking what you're saying is that this is a necessary step someplace along the way. Obviously, it would be a process. It doesn't happen instantaneously. But do you have, from your experience of working with groups, a set of procedures that can be used to change mindsets? And I guess, do you think that this is actually something that has to happen to see some of these changes that we've been talking about occur?
Well, yes, it has to happen. It is incredibly difficult. I think a part of it is engaging credible parties, whether they be business or academic institutions, to begin that discussion. But you're trying to work your way through, in some cases, 100 years of history, and it's extremely difficult. I know that's an inadequate answer, but it is very, very difficult, and maybe we can work on the next generation.
I think it is in part a generational issue, but I would suggest that the key is to align environmental and economic imperatives, and that we will see change when people feel it in their pocketbooks.
I feel like I'm playing bridge. I'm being finessed into producing one of my interesting cards I was going to use at the end. Yeah, let me be somewhat controversial. I think the myth that we have created in Western Canada about the national energy policy is just that, a myth. And it's a distorting myth that constrains our ability to have a decent and productive dialogue about energy policy in Canada. Let me give you a few facts that are sort of counterfactual to the world that we've heard in two or three talks in the last few hours. In 1979, the major chartered banks were forecasting $200 a barrel oil, WTI, West Texas Intermediate, which was then the reference point for North America. They were investing in things like Hudson Bay Oil and Gas and others, Dome, at the assumption of $200 a barrel. By late 79, they halved their price to $100 a barrel, which still looked pretty good because we were running around $30, $35 a barrel at that point. Then the NEP comes along, and it actually came after they halved their oil prices, not before. Anybody remember what happened in 1981? Interest rates spiked at 19.5% prime. What's the most investment-intensive industry in Western Canada? Energy. So 19.5% knocked that industry flat. You go look at drilling records. They started to drop almost simultaneously with that spike in interest rates. And it had nothing to do with the NEP. It had to do everything with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and Jerry Bowie and others shifting the underpinnings of the global financial system to no longer tolerating inflation. 1982, we had a global recession, steeper even than the one we've just had. And that one took oil prices from $150 to $50, almost overnight. And so you've got, and then what happened in 1986, if I remember correctly, I may be off by a couple of months. By 1986, OPEC as a supply managing system had collapsed. Their internal structures had ceased to exist in controlling supply, and WTI dropped below, I think, within a few cents of $6 a barrel. Of course there was a collapse in the energy sector. It had nothing to do with some redistribution of rents between two levels of government in a small part of Western North America. It's a story we like to tell ourselves, and yes, it did affect our individual pocketbooks as citizens and citizens in Western Canada, but it was not about the collapse of the industry. So the fact that we've had that story carried with us for now 30 years, that it was the demise, and heaven forbid that we ever get back into a policy dialogue that might lead to national systems around energy management is, I think, part of the problem. Now, let me flip the story. I think by the same token, the irrational exuberance, I think, is what the former governor of the U.S. Federal Reserve said, is what we're facing right now. There's this sense that everything's on a straight line uphill. Well, that sounds to me like 1979 when I worked for a chartered bank and everybody was saying $200 a barrel. And within 5 years, $6 a barrel. If you're going to invest at 200, I don't know, the expectation of 200 and take 6, there's going to be a massive shakeout. So I think one of the things we need to do if we're going to talk about policy in the 21st century is unpack some of the myths that we live with and that we've grown up with. And some of us who lived through it have part of the story, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody do the whole story. We've got probably 50 to 100 books in Canada that blame the demise of the oil patch in the 80s and the shrinking of Calgary in the mid to late 80s on the NEP. But it's mythologizing rather than evidence. And as a policy professor, I try and encourage my students to think about, if not creating evidence-based policy, at least evidence-informed policy. So in this context, I think we have to start unpacking some of the myths that limit our ability to have effective public dialogue about not just this area, but a wide range of policy issues in Western Canada.
Peter, thank you. So Peter was obviously saving something for the very end. Jeremy, Steve, do you have something that you were saving for the very end? Any last questions from our audience? Anything you were saving for the very end? Well, if not, I would like to, on behalf of all of you, thank our three panelists for a very interesting afternoon. I have some small gifts in appreciation of the work that they've done from the conference, and I will pass them out as soon as we're done here. So please join me.